much, Malcolm. You all can hear me, see my slides okay? All right. Excellent. Make sure I can move them. Here we go. So thank you so much to Jim and Malcolm for the invitation. I'm excited to be here today to be able to share this work with all of you who I understand are a very international group. I don't see any people, so I have only the little number 27 in the participants to indicate that there's some ghostly people out there somewhere. So hello. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about a recent set of studies that we did in my lab, looking at how children and adults reason about morally good acts. And all of the work that I'm going to talk about today was led by my graduate student, Iman Khan, along with 2 undergraduate students in my lab, Maya Jaffer-Diaz and Anahit Najafizadeh. So moral psychology. As it's been studied for the last many decades, it might well have been called, as Simon Baron-Cohen put it, the science of evil, right? So, so psychology is often the psychology, moral psychology is often the psychology of the wrong and the bad, right? Of how we judge people, blame people, punish people, which acts we think are wrong. Some of the most influential work in moral psychology is focused on things like what kinds of bad deeds different sorts of people are sensitive to, the really interesting debate about whether there can be harmless wrongs, why we think an action is worse than an omission, and any number of topics like this. And maybe this is for good reason. So in this really cool paper in Science, Hoffman and colleagues asked people 5 times a day for 3 days to report the moral and immoral acts that they had discussed in the past hour. And just like psychologists, it turns out that people are more interested in the immoral than the moral. So people are more than twice as likely to have recently talked about immoral acts rather than moral acts. And maybe this makes sense, right? It's important to know when someone has done something wrong, like stolen a car, than when they haven't done something wrong, they just pass by the car without incident. And it's more important maybe to communicate these things to those around us or communicate to our children about what they shouldn't do, what things are bad, than what's, okay to do, right? And so this also fits with kind of a broader negativity bias that's been well documented in lots of different domains. So in general, we're just more attentive to the bad than the good. But there's another side to morality, right? So our highest moral heroes are those people that don't simply refrain from acting immorally, but who go above and beyond what's required of them, who give to the world and sacrifice of themselves more than any moral philosophy would require them to do. And these sorts of super moral acts that go above and beyond what we're obligated to do are known as supererogatory acts. And so I'll be saying that word a lot today. You might think of people who are particularly well known for these kinds of sacrifices, like Mother Teresa or Gandhi. But it turns out that there's more anonymous people doing these kinds of things too. So this fascinating book by Larissa McFarquhar tells us stories of these extreme do-gooders. And people like a not particularly wealthy couple who adopted 20 children, many of them with profound disabilities, and took care of them. Another couple who founded a leper colony in India. There's a woman who donates a kidney to a stranger, and other people who give away almost everything they earn to people who are more needy, even if that means they really suffer a downgrade of their own lifestyles, even to the point of eating out of dumpsters in some cases. So it's an interesting aspect of moral psychology that we often feel a bit like conflicted and tense when we're thinking about people like this. So on one hand, many of us might admire these people, think of them as being super morally good. And maybe they sort of even inspire us to be better ourselves. We think of them as sort of a way of being to aspire to. Or conversely, maybe we just sort of feel grateful that these people are doing this kind of stuff so that we don't have to, right? But along with these positive feelings, we might find that there's something kind of unsettling about this kind of extreme morality. So we find it kind of pretty weird to act this way, right? Maybe it's aversive in some way. So there's been discussion in both philosophy and psychology about the reasons that we might dislike people who are extremely virtuous. Maybe because they make us feel bad about ourselves in comparison, or maybe we feel like they're violating some sort of expectation or norm, right? Trying to change the norm for the way that I act. And in some of these cases, we might even worry about people who want to give away all of their, money or kidneys to strangers, as wondering whether they're actually sort of mentally stable or need some sort of intervention or counseling. But not all supererogatory acts are so extreme. So when we look back at this daily morality study, it turns out that people also reported on the kinds of moral acts that they were most likely to commit, be a target of, or witness. And in all of these cases, it turns out that people report many more morally good actions than morally bad ones. So yes, we like to gossip about people behaving badly, but actually morally good acts play an overall bigger role in our day-to-day lives. So just things like holding doors open for people, or giving money to the homeless as you pass by, or helping a friend move apartments. All of these acts we see as sort of morally good, but they're not required of us, right? It wouldn't be okay if we didn't do them. And so we became interested in how people judge what makes an action particularly morally good or morally praiseworthy. And it occurred to us that there's an interesting asymmetry in how we reason about morally good acts and morally bad acts, and how this relates to obligation. So some acts we see as obligatory, not murdering your spouse, for example. But if I started this talk off by praising you all for not murdering your spouses or partners today, well, maybe some of you would wonder how I knew. But most of you would think it was pretty odd to praise you for simply not committing murder, right? It's kind of neutral. So here's our neutral bar, but obviously murdering your spouse, failing to fulfill the obligation, is seen as very morally blameworthy. On the other hand, when people go above and beyond what's required of them, so say someone who donates a kidney to a stranger, we see this as very morally praiseworthy. But when someone decides not to donate their kidney to a stranger, we don't see this as blameworthy. We see it again as pretty neutral, right? So that all might seem really obvious to you, but actually this intuitive asymmetry doesn't seem to fit very well with the principles of many moral philosophies. So taking a utilitarian approach, for example, suggests that we should just add up the possible pleasure and pain that's associated with some action. And whichever action kind of has the most points or utils is what we should do. That's the thing that we are sort of morally obligated to do. And so here there should be a complementary relationship between judgments of right and wrong. So if doing something is very bad, then not doing that thing should be seen as very good. And if doing something is very good, then not doing that thing should be seen as very bad. So the idea of something being extremely morally good, but not required of us to do, just it doesn't fit very well into these frameworks. But the fact that this seems to be such a strong part of our ordinary intuitions has led philosophers to really sort of like grapple with this question of supererogation. They certainly, try to address it and try to find a way to fit it into these moral frameworks. But it is still a sort of hot topic of debate, and philosophers have come to call it the paradox of supererogation. So like, how can it be that there are these things that are sort of the morally best thing that we could do in a situation, and yet we're not required to do them? But despite the difficulties that this idea has posed to philosophers, when we started thinking about this, we started out thinking that when it comes to our moral psychology, at least, the idea that moral praise is reserved for the times when we go above and beyond what we are obliged to do seem like just kind of really obvious, and so obvious that it sort of seemed pointless to even ask people about it, right? And it wasn't just us. So in a recent theoretical paper exploring psychological differences between moral praise and moral blame, the authors also just totally took this for granted. So they defined praise itself as judgment of moral responsibility directed at agents who have performed acts that exceed the call of duty and obligation. So building the idea of going above and beyond obligation into the basic definition of what makes something praiseworthy, right? But the more we talked about this in our lab, the more we realized that even amongst ourselves, there was a lot of variation in the kinds of things we thought of as obligatory. And we had sort of a very global group in the lab at the time. And they give us some hints that there could even be some cultural differences in how praiseworthy people from different cultures thought these kinds of supererogatory actions were. So we became interested in thinking about the question of where our intuitions and judgments about supererogatory actions come from. The sort of basic question is this part of our kind of fundamental moral psychology, something we'd expect to be universal and early emerging in development? Or is it possible that this thing that seems really basic could actually be an unusual, maybe even a weird kind of psychology specific to certain groups? So we decided to start exploring this question by examining how young children reason about morally praiseworthy actions to get at this question of, is it an early emerging kind of psychology? And there's some reason to think that children reason pretty differently about what's morally praiseworthy than adults do. To start with, in some previous work that I've done, we asked how children and adults judge people who do the right thing after they've struggled with the temptation of doing the wrong thing. So we told them some stories about two kids who both did the same good action, like telling the truth or keeping a promise. But one of the kids was really tempted to lie to keep out of trouble or break a promise so they could go have fun. But then in the end, they overcame that temptation and they did the right thing anyway. And then we compared this to a child who didn't have that bad temptation and just sort of easily did the right thing. And so both of the kids in the end did the same morally good action, but we asked adults and children which kid deserved more moral praise or was more morally good. And what we found, so here I'm going to show you bars going up from the middle, representing a preference for the person who was never tempted to act immorally, and bars going down from the middle, representing a preference for the person who overcame their temptation and did the right thing anyway. And what we found is that adults tended to praise someone who overcame the temptation and did the right thing anyway, while kids between 3 and 8 years old strongly went in the other direction. So they were penalizing people for having had this immoral temptation in the first place and preferred the person who just easily did the right thing. So this is, one bit of evidence that suggests that, at least in some ways, children at this age are reasoning pretty differently than adults about what sorts of acts deserve moral praise. There's also some great work looking more directly at how children reason about obligations. And I'm going to tell you about a few recent studies led by Julia Marshall. So in the first one, she asked children whether it's better to help a friend or help a stranger. And she found that unlike adults, children aged 5 to 6 thought that it was morally better to help your friend than to help a stranger. And along with these developmental differences in reasoning about obligation, Marshall's also found that these differences, these judgments differ between cultures. So in this very cool, big recent paper, they asked children and adults across 5 different cultures about who was obligated to help who, and found that children across most cultures and adults in some cultures thought that even strangers are obligated to help other people in certain circumstances. But adults in other cultures, including in the US, thought that only sort of really close relationships made you obligated to help someone. And it's totally okay not to help a stranger in most cases. Marshall also found that children seem to have this really broad notion of what kinds of things we're obligated to do. So in another study, she found that 4 and 5-year-olds think that not only sort of teachers or people in a position of authority are obligated to sort of intervene and punish people for wrongdoing, but that even peers are obligated to punish someone who does something wrong. And this isn't the judgments of adults. We don't typically think that, children are obligated to punish other children when they do something wrong. And so it's this kind of broad sense across the spectrum here that the kids have of obligations being kind of broader than adults than adults seem to see them as, with some cultural differences thrown into the mix. And it turns out that developmental differences in what's viewed as obligatory exist across a bunch of different types of moral actions. So this is another study that was led by Odd and Dahl, and they asked children and adults which sorts of acts were obligatory, which were supererogatory. They also asked about negative acts. And so I'm just focusing on what's above the yellow lines here. These are the positive moral actions. You can ignore the categories along the x-axis for now. The key point is that what they found is that 3 to 5-year-olds, that's at the top here, rated almost all the morally good acts, so 82% of them, as obligatory. And only a few, these are the ones highlighted in blue, they viewed as supererogatory, so good but not required. Whereas when you look at the adults, they viewed the majority of pro-social acts as supererogatory. So children were seeing a lot more of the good acts that they were asked about as obligatory. And so all of these studies seem to suggest that there's reason to think that the psychology of moral praise might be something that undergoes some pretty big developmental changes. And so what about this question of how we judge supererogatory actions? And so that's what we set out to explore. And in our initial set of studies, we wanted to investigate whether children and adults just have this category of things that are morally good, but not required. And if so, kind of how do they judge them? Or what do they think of them? So for the first study, we came up with 2 sets of actions, some that we thought were obligatory and some that we thought were supererogatory. And we asked children and adults to rate how good or bad it was to do or not do these actions. So here's some examples. This is an example of an obligatory action. This is Kate. She wants a lollipop, but she doesn't have enough money. And so she leaves the store and doesn't steal the lollipop. So as adults, our sense was that this isn't the sort of thing you get a lot of moral credit for. It's morally required that you not steal. And we don't generally go around praising people for refraining from it. But then consider bad Kate. So she wants a lollipop, and in this case, she steals it. And so now she's done something that she was obligated not to do. And so this is the sort of thing that we would normally judge to be immoral and blameworthy. And then compare that to Julie, who sees that her neighbor's driveway needs shoveling and just goes over and does it. So this seems pretty praiseworthy. She definitely wasn't obligated to do that. And then here's bad Julie, who sees that it needs doing, but she just does her own driveway and goes inside. So as someone living in, snowy Canada, not right now, thankfully, I can verify this is totally the norm. You just shovel your own driveway, right? We don't think that Julie's done anything particularly wrong here. And so, this was our intuition in creating, this set of stimuli. And so we wanted to get a broader sense of how people would view these kinds of actions. So we showed American and Canadian adults and 5 to 8-year-old children, 8 different actions like this, either all positive or all negative. And then we asked them, was it good, bad, or just okay that Julie shoveled or didn't shovel her neighbor's driveway? And then if they said it was good or bad, we asked them, was it a little good, medium good, or super good, or bad? And then took these judgments all together. They created a scale that ran from -3, which was super bad, to +3, which was super good, with this kind of midpoint of 0, right? Which was just neutral, just okay, not really good or bad. And so here's what we found. So I'm going to show you the judgments about bad actions first. So as you might expect, adults thought, just to orient you to the graph, because these are bad actions, they're going down from the midpoint. So the lower they are, the more bad they were judged to be. As you might expect, adults thought it was pretty bad to violate obligatory moral norms like not stealing or not telling the truth. But when we asked them about failing to do supererogatory actions like shoveling your neighbor's driveway, they were almost perfectly at the neutral point. So they just saw this as neither good nor bad, just neutral. Kids also thought it was really bad not to do the obligatory actions, and less bad not to do the supererogatory actions. But something interesting that's here and sort of in keeping with the previous work is that unlike adults, children rated supererogatory actions as significantly more immoral than sort of that neutral point. So they are seeing a difference between these two types of actions, and it's the same sort of difference that adults are seeing, but children still think it's a little bit bad not to, shovel your neighbor's driveway. Okay, and now what we were really interested in was what kinds of actions get moral praise, right? And so when we asked about the good actions, we found that now we're going up from the midpoint. Just like our intuitions in creating these scenarios, adults thought that it was more morally good to do the supererogatory actions than the obligatory actions. But children, again, seem to be thinking about these things differently. So 5-year-olds actually rated it as better to do the obligatory actions, like not stealing, than the supererogatory actions, like shoveling the neighbor's driveway. So this difference here, it wasn't quite significant, but the overall interaction was significant, and suggests that children and adults reason in really different ways about these actions. So we were surprised by these findings. I mean, it was exploratory. We weren't sure what we were going to find, but it really seemed to be the children were reasoning almost exactly oppositely to adults about these actions. So we wanted to kind of press a little bit harder on this question, right? And so our next thought was, well, maybe it's not that children think it's better to do obligatory acts, but maybe given what was found in some of those previous studies, children were seeing more of the actions that we described as obligatory, right? So they tend to see obligation everywhere. So maybe they just thought that a lot of things were obligatory, and they don't have different views about what's morally good, but instead they just have different views about what's obligatory. So we did the study again, just focusing on the good actions. And we had 2 goals. One was just to replicate study 1. And the second was just to add a question asking directly whether they viewed these actions as obligatory. So we asked them, did she have to do that? Or would it be okay if she didn't shovel her neighbor's driveway? And so here I'm going to show you the number of actions of each type that participants thought were obligatory. So adults, as we expected, judged almost all of the obligatory actions as obligatory and thought very few. Oh, I forgot to say, we also added a third category of personal choice actions, just like choosing between a blue t-shirt and a yellow t-shirt. And this was just to give us kind of a baseline to see how these other judgments related to kind of a really neutral thing. And so adults were viewing supererogatory actions as equally not obligatory as wearing a yellow shirt. Like, you just don't have to do it. And then they viewed the obligatory actions as obligatory. So that's just sort of like a manipulation check, basically. Now we wanted to know, how do children rate these? And it turns out that children had really similar judgments. So they viewed almost all the obligatory events as obligatory, but the personal choice and supererogatory acts were seen as much less obligatory, though they did see the supererogatory acts as a little more obligatory than adults did, but still well below sort of the chance level. And so maybe kind of surprisingly, given the previous studies that I've talked about, children do seem to have an understanding that some actions can be good to do, but not morally required. So now that we've made this difference between obligatory actions and supererogatory actions really salient for children, by just having them confirm to us out loud that some of these actions are required, but others go above and beyond what's required. Did that make their judgments look more like adults' judgments, right? And well, no. So 5 to 8-year-olds again thought that doing supererogatory acts was pretty good, but doing obligatory ones was even better. So we see the same pattern of results as before, except this time an even bigger difference between the supererogatory and the obligatory, and possibly because children were really focused on the obligatory nature of the actions, which you might think would work against our findings, but instead actually amplified them. So they seem to really mean it, right? They really think that obligatory actions are more morally praiseworthy than supererogatory actions. They also think that supererogatory acts are more morally praiseworthy than just a personal choice, like choosing a color of a t-shirt. So they do see supererogatory actions as significantly praiseworthy. They're sort of medium good, but just not as good as fulfilling your obligations. Okay, so children at this age really do seem to think that it's better to do obligatory actions than supererogatory actions. In our final study, we thought, well, so far we've been using the set of actions that we just generated ourselves. And even though our question about whether the acts were obligatory gave us some confirmation that kids and adults were both seeing these kinds of actions in the same way that we did, but maybe there's some other kind of difference in the sets of actions that we generated that we hadn't thought of or identified. And so maybe there's something else in there that's driving children's judgments. So in the next study, we did what we think is a strong test of these findings or of this hypothesis, and compared the very same action framed in an obligatory way versus framed in a supererogatory way. So Julie either shovels her neighbor's driveway because she just sees that it needs to be done, does it out of the goodness of her heart, or because her mother comes out and tells her to go do it. So both of these things are morally good, right? And any Canadian kid would be praised for doing either one of them. But we asked children and adults to make a forced choice. So they both did something good, but who was more good? And so here, I'm going to show you bars going up from the midpoint, indicating a preference for the supererogatory actor, and bars going down from the midpoint, indicating a preference for the obligatory actor. And maybe unsurprisingly by this point, we found that adults strongly prefer the supererogatory actor, almost at ceiling. But again, even with this sort of head-to-head comparison, the youngest kids thought the child who shoveled the driveway when her mother told her to was morally better. They had a significant preference for the obligatory action. And here was the first time we saw a bit of a developmental trend in our data. So the kids, the 7 to 8-year-olds, were somewhere in the middle. Now they were judging that the supererogatory actors were better, but not as often as the adults did. So they're significantly less likely to say that than adults still. So you see this kind of trend where they're starting to move toward the adult-like pattern of judgments. Okay, so that's all the data that I'm going to talk about today. And for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to speculate wildly about why we might be seeing these kinds of developmental differences and what they might mean, right? So one simple possibility might be that kids are doing a simple kind of math here, right? So maybe they're thinking, well, both people ended up shoveling the driveway. So they both get some kind of moral points for doing this good action. And then the girl on the right also did what her mother asked her to do. And so she gets extra points for that, right? And that's how they end up preferring the obligatory acts. So that's one possibility. I think another interesting possibility might be that, like moral psychologists and like adults in a lot of different domains, children are just really obsessed with what's bad. So they know it would be really bad to lie or to steal. And so they're just kind of flipping those judgments and thinking it must be really good not to do those things. So ideas suggest that they sort of start with a psychology of the morally wrong, just like, this talk did. And then they sort of use that to scaffold their psychology of moral praise. Another way to think about this is that children are doing a kind of counterfactual reasoning. So they're thinking, well, it would have been so bad if Kate had stole the lollipop, right? And so it's really good that she didn't steal it. So this kind of flip maps on pretty well to what kids' judgments look like in these studies. And going back to our brief discussion of the paradox of supererogation, in a certain way of thinking about it, children's judgments here make a lot of sense. So if something is really good to do, it should really be bad not to do it in a sort of like opportunity cost kind of way. But this doesn't map well onto the way that adults are judging these kinds of actions. And so we might ask instead, actually, why are adults reasoning in this way? And an interesting idea that came out of thinking about these results, and like I said, the sort of cultural variation among different members of the lab, very small n there, but we thought, well, maybe the intuition that children lack, that there's something sort of particularly praiseworthy about doing these good acts that you're not obligated to do, maybe that's actually the harder view to justify. And at a minimum, these data suggest that maybe this intuition might not be universal. So as I talked about earlier, there's cross-cultural variation and judgments about obligations, like what we owe to family, whether strangers are obligated to help. So maybe the sort of special reverence that we like Western adults have for these supererogatory actions, maybe we'll see similar kind of cross-cultural variation if we explore that. It might turn out that this intuition that seems really obvious that we started out thinking, why would we even ask about this, could actually be something of a weird way of thinking about morality. Of course, this is total speculation at this point. So I've been eager to collect some cross-cultural data to help answer some of these questions. But in the meantime, I've kind of imagined, what would it mean if it turned out either way, right? So imagine it turns out that we see this same pattern across lots of cultures where children praise obligatory acts and then adults praise supererogatory acts, right? And I think this leads to another speculative possibility, which I'll just end this talk with. And that is that as adults, what we're really doing when we're making moral judgments is we're focused on what this tells us about the person's character. So this is a view held by lots of people, both in philosophy, going back to Aristotle, and psychology. So there's lots of great work on this idea of character judgments by lots of people. I think it's been especially convincingly argued by David Pizarro in several different papers and his colleagues. There's also sort of conversely some classic findings in developmental psychology that suggests that children are surprisingly bad about making inferences about people's character based on their behavior. And so maybe as adults, our goal is to figure out this kind of broader character judgment. We have the idea that it's only when people do actions that aren't required of them or act against their immoral temptations, things like that, that we really learn something about who they are as a person. And that this is the idea that might take a surprisingly long time to develop. And I'll end there. Thanks.
I don't know if you can hear me clapping with the headphones, but well done. That was amazing. So interesting. We've got people thanking you in the chat. So fascinating and lots to think about. We've got a few questions coming up in the chat. So I'll go through those. So Simon Myers is asking, I was wondering whether children's appraisals match adults' appraisals of their expectations of children. So what he means by this is that for adults, praising the fulfillment of an obligation could be seen as patronizing, but we commonly praise children for the fulfillment of actions, and maybe because we just expect more of adults. So it would be expected that children are more likely to praise the fulfillment of obligation because it's something that they themselves are usually praised for.
Yeah,
so
it's interesting.
Simon.
I've thought about that a little bit too, because it's interesting that, there's this big developmental difference in how we praise, it's sort of just doing what you're supposed to, right? Mm-hmm. And so I definitely think it's true that children are often praised just for, not hitting their brother or whatever. Yeah. And I do think that could certainly contribute to children in turn sort of praising obligatory actions mm-hmm. more. But I don't think that children, there's an issue of sort of frequency here. So it may be that kids aren't often going above and beyond. But I don't know. I think that's like an empirical question. I think that would be some really interesting data to have, is like, how often do kids get praised for supererogatory actions as well? But given adult psychology, it seems like certainly they're going to be praised more for doing supererogatory acts, that is more profusely, if not more often, right? So there are these two pieces of it, right? Is like, how often do they hear the praise, and then how much praise do they get? And so I don't think it's obvious exactly what kind of feedback they're getting. And I think that those would be really interesting data to feed into, a question of like why these developmental differences exist. But I think it's really an open question, given that like adults' judgments should be transmitted to kids, right? So adults think that supererogatory things are better, then they should be communicating that to kids if there's the opportunity to do that. That I think we just don't know, but I think it's really interesting.
Great, thank you. So next question is coming up is from Shiri Spitz, who's saying, "Hi, Christina, thanks for the awesome talk." So this is coming, during the talk. So she said, "You may get to this, but she was wondering how children are thinking about the universalizability of supererogatory actions. That is, maybe an adult thinks about shoveling one's neighbor's driveway and reasons that if they're not obligated to shovel the whole neighborhood, then they're not obligated to shovel just one neighbor's driveway. So perhaps children are just focusing on the one neighbor mentioned in this scenario."
Right. So I think that's a question about whether kids might see it as obligatory, but adults think it can't possibly be obligatory because then you'd be required to shovel the whole neighborhood. So that might have been before we got to the sort of, is it obligatory study?
Yeah.
So we asked them that question just to kind of get at that. Yeah. Are they seeing this as obligatory? Yeah. And they don't. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Oh, and Emily Gurdon is asking, "Great talk, Christina. Thinking about your speculation number 2, that children are thinking about the bad and reasoning counterfactually. If children were reasoning counterfactually in that way, then wouldn't you think that they would have said it was better to have been tempted to do bad but still do good, because it would really have been bad if they actually did the thing, rather than not be tempted at all, as you found in the 2016 paper?" And she's saying, "Let me know if this question doesn't make sense." And as a reminder, you can see these questions yourself if you prefer to read them, if you click the Q&A box. So I'm reading them out just for the benefit of everyone, but you can read it yourself if it's easier to read it than hear me reading someone else's words.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, right. So I think Emily's saying this kind of counterfactual reasoning could explain the data in these studies, but doesn't it seem like it wouldn't explain the data in the previous temptation-oriented studies? Because, let me just read this again, because it would have been really bad. It's better to be tempted to do bad, but still do good, because it would have been really bad if they actually did the thing. I think the counterfactual in those studies is that, so you have someone who is tempted to do a bad thing and then does the good thing. So the counterfactual, I think, is just that they weren't tempted to do the bad thing. I don't know, there's different counterfactuals in that study. I guess you could kind of spin it a few different ways. So I'm not sure the logic applies to that study. Like they sort of just might not be thinking about it in that way when they're asked about that kind of situation. But I think sort of different things could be at work in the two different studies, I guess, is my basic answer. Though, Emily, I'd love to talk more about that thought and just kind of wrestle with it a little bit.
Okay. Next, Diane Sunar had a few sort of comments that I'll sort of put as, I guess, questions to you. So one is wondering which cultures were checked. So I know you talked about doing this cross-culturally in the future, but where were the data collected? Was it Canada, America? We know Canadians notoriously friendly and helpful, so that might be a problem. And they're also saying that is the phenomenon may be related to the development of theory of mind. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, okay, so for the cultures, our data is from children and adults in the US and Canada. And so, yes, exactly, these cross-cultural differences, would not have been detected. If you were asking about the other sort of cross-cultural differences I mentioned, I don't remember all the countries. I know it was United States, India, Uganda. You can check it out. It's a recent JEP General paper with Julia Marshall as the first author. Okay, about theory of mind. So, yeah, I mean, our kids are 5 to 8. And so typically this age range will have a pretty well-developed, at least sort of first order theory of mind abilities. So that's something that, we often kind of think about when kids are just it's almost like they're not getting it. But here, I think it wasn't the pattern of data didn't suggest to us that they sort of didn't know what was going on. But they just really robustly were like, yeah, those aren't required and they're better to do. So they sort of, gave us every reason to think that their judgments were really like legitimate. I'm interested to think if there's a specific aspect of theory of mind, because obviously like it's not one thing that you sort of learn at age 4 and then you you got it. So these sort of more complicated second order, third order kind of theory of mind things can still be going on, certainly with this age group. I haven't thought of any that seem sort of particularly connected to the things that that we're seeing, but definitely, Diane, if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Great. And next is from Fabio Bella, who's asking, to what extent do you think the pattern of results among children reflects the way that adults raise children? So parents may judge children's behavior differently from adults' behaviors. And if parents praise and blame certain behaviors in their children, then that could be what children learn. And then as they grow, the behavior is judged progressively as adult behavior. So I think this is getting on a similar theme to, as Simon was suggesting earlier, it's about how adults are raising, expecting children's behavior.
Yeah, no, I think so. Just to sort of briefly say again what I said before, I think that adults definitely praise children for doing things that are just obligatory, much more so than we would praise adults for doing that. But I think that there should be even more praise for doing something doing something supererogatory. So I think that there's like a real need here for some sort of daily morality praise kind of study, daily moral praise. That sounds good to me. And kind of just getting a better sense of what parents actually are praising children for doing.
Okay, now Sean Lauren is asking, just a thought, our kids may be psychologically lazy. It's good to do things you have to do, but why would you do things that you aren't obligated to do? So maybe kids think it's almost foolish to do things that you don't have to do. And I like that.
Yeah, I really like that idea too. Like I said, when we started out thinking about this, we thought there's just like this obvious way of thinking about supererogatory actions. And then as we've seen the data come in and I've talked to, other people who, people, in the lab and otherwise who have had other views, I've sort of started to almost be able to flip my mind into that way of thinking about things. Like, well, these supererogatory actions are great and all, but like, who cares? Like, that's not what's important. You didn't have to do that. You have to not steal. You have to, not murder your spouse. And so, that's what we're focused on. And those things are just kind of gravy. They're just kind of, this extra stuff that like, that's nice that you did that, but I don't care that much, and it's like a little mental voodoo. I can almost sort of get my mind into thinking that way. And maybe that is the way that kids and maybe even some adults kind of think about supererogatory action. So I think we have more to do, but actually say one more thing, which is that the characterization of it as lazy, I think ties in nicely to a bunch of other data, some from my lab and from other labs where kids kind of don't like things that are effortful. So it's another way to think about those temptation studies as well, which is adults sort of view the person who did the right thing after having the temptation to do the wrong thing as kind of having done something harder. Right? It was like harder for him to do the right thing. And so he deserves credit for overcoming, for using willpower, for, expending that kind of moral effort. And kids don't see it that way. They don't like the person who took more effort to do the right thing. And then we have some other studies where just kind of in totally non-moral domain where adults value things like paintings that took more effort those are classic findings, but we did this developmentally and we found that kids don't share this judgment. So they're either in some studies, they're kind of like, they don't care, or they actually prefer the one who took less effort, sort of did it more easily. And so it could be kind of this broader sense that, and likewise, the supererogatory thing is kind of like this extra effort that you didn't have to do. So maybe kids are like anti-effort and it takes a while to learn that. That's something we've been exploring as well.
Quick question from me, sort of following on from this. So in the studies, you ask if I remember correctly, it's like how good and like how good would it to be to do this? Like the action is just okay, or like a little bit good, super good. Do you ask about? Do you either ask about the character, like is this a good child or a bad child, and do you look at sort of more, I guess, like more behavioral indexes? Like who would they trust more? Are they, even if they say that the obligatory action is better, would they maybe trust to like distribute sweets or toys, maybe the child who just does a supererogatory act? Do you have any data on that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. We don't. Let me think. I think we have explanation data, though I'm not remembering it right now. But other than that, we didn't ask them about character judgments, and we didn't ask them sort of these trust or, kind of behavioral things. But I think those are all really cool things to ask. If we were asking adults, we could do it all in one study, but with kids, it's like each one is a new study.
A lot harder then.
But I think that'd be really interesting to know.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. Next, the Ching is asking, thanks for the great talk, Christina. Is it possible that adults are just more accurate in calculating or better at imagining how much time or effort the supererogatory acts demand? So they equal sacrifice to praise. Like the more sacrifice you have to go, then the more praiseworthy the supererogatory act is because it's supererogatory. But maybe children haven't kind of acquired this concept of self-sacrifice to justify the praise.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's complicated. Part of the answer to your question might be kind of related to what I said about effort, right? Which is maybe there is this kind of huge shift that seems to be going on in how kids think about effort. So that's, sacrifice and effort are sort of related concepts. But there's another way, I think, of taking your question, which is like thinking that the supererogatory acts are more of a sacrifice than the obligatory acts. And I'm not sure that that's true if you sort of remove yourself from the, from the kind of standard way of thinking that supererogatory acts are more morally good, right? So if you take a neutral stance to that, then, shoveling your neighbor's driveway, well, maybe that's like, it depends how much it snowed, but like lying to get out of trouble or like not stealing something you really want, like those could be much more of a sacrifice. So I think the question of kind of how hard it is or how much you want to not do it is independent of whether it's obligatory or supererogatory, and some of each could be sort of more sacrificial. So it's more sacrificial if you assume you don't have to do it. But if you sort of take that out of the equation, then I think the sort of magnitude of the act can vary within both categories.
I suppose in a way, like your studies where you have the same action as well sort of speak against this as well, because it is literally the same sacrifice in both cases.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Oh gosh, I'm very sorry. I'm not. I mean, Meltem would know. Betul. Betul. Is asking. I know you don't have data yet on the cross-cultural aspect, but when we talk about praise, they think it's more common in the West than other parts of the world. So it'd be interesting to see if children who are not praised for obligatory action or even supererogatory action distinct and the same, or even how adults think about other adults. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, again, this question of like getting those data of like how kids are praised would be super interesting. But I think even if we don't, like, even if we assume that there are differences there, we could still see really similar psychology across cultures, because we're not actually asking them. I sometimes use sort of praise and like, judge morally good in the same way, in the same sort of interchangeably. But I think that even in cultures where morally good acts aren't praised outwardly, or that's sort of not just like not the way that people interact with each other. Still, you have sort of an inner judgment about whether that act was good or not. And here, this is what we're asking, is just like, was that good or bad? And so I think, again, there's just sort of separable aspects of this, right? But maybe, going back to the previous idea, like maybe the fact of whether children are praised for certain types of things could contribute to some cultural differences in what we see with the kids. So yeah.
Because my immediate response would have been like, well, surely all cultures have both obligatory and supererogatory actions. It's just that the content of what is supererogatory versus obligatory might vary, for example, between more collectivist cultures. But then as you were talking, I was like, well, actually, I don't know that, because I've never really lived or experienced another culture. Maybe that the distinction doesn't even make as much sense. That would be really interesting. If anyone has kind of readings or from philosophy or anything about that they know of, please do share in the chat. That's such an interesting thing to think about, even just normatively, aside from psychologically, how this differs across cultures. And again, that's one of the nice things about this international group, is that with such an international basis, we can start to think and share our knowledge about this, and move out of this very like US, Europe, UK centric way of thinking. So we've got a last question now. We've just got 2 minutes left, and we're back to the start, back to Simon, who's saying he's wondering whether the purpose of praise is different for adults and children. So maybe we praise children just to reinforce the behavior we want to continue, whereas praising adults seems to be more about communicating who is particularly pro-social. So I guess going back to this character element that you talked about. So if we praise the behaviors of adults, we should think it's obligatory. If we praise behaviors of adults we think should be obligatory, it can erroneously communicate that we think they've gone above and beyond. For example, lots of people push back against praising Keanu Reeves having an age-appropriate girlfriend, arguing that yes, it's good, but it shouldn't be praised. It should simply be expected. So praise is inappropriate. I was not aware of this, but that's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, praise seems, because we praise things in this way, where we praise what's not obligatory, then if we praise something, it makes it seem like it was not obligatory. And so it kind of it can have this sort of weird, like negative connotation in a way where, but I think that way of thinking about it, it's sort of, it builds in the assumption that we only praise things that are not obligatory. But going back to the beginning of the question, I think the purpose of praise definitely could well be different for adults than for children. I think we try to be careful not to ask for praise, but just to ask for a moral judgment for that reason. So hopefully that goes part of the way to dealing with that worry, at least. But I think it can be sort of built in, like, as we've been talking about this whole time, into kind of what children hear and then what judgments they produce.
And I said that was the last question, but just a really, really quick follow-on thing. Do you think that there's a difference between the kind of functions of praise and blame? Like, I know this is not necessarily your exact talk, but it's just, do you think that they are the functions of the reinforcement? Are they the same, or is there work suggesting that they are kind of different functionally as well?
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really thorny question to have as our last question. I think probably there's similarities, probably there's differences. There's actually a really cool recent, I think it was Ticks, but I'm not sure. Recent theoretical article. I know David Pizarro is one of the authors. Maybe Molly Crockett. Oh, you must know. Looking at sort of differences between praise and blame. I'll find it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but that does sound really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. It's very cool stuff.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Okay, well, that is our hour up. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. We've had a lot of interest and questions in the Q&A today. I think this topic has really appealed to everyone, and I know I'm going away from it with a lot of questions in my mind of how we think about praise and blame and obligatory and supererogatory. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear from you. Thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to come and listen today. And we will be back next month with someone that I can't remember, because I know who we have coming up, but I can't remember who is September. It could be Ayal, or is it Bryana? I'm not sure. It is someone, and they're going to give a very interesting talk. But read the emails. We will send out the links.
It is Brian, and with the ECR data blitz from Christian.
Yes, from Aarhus. Yeah, perfect. Great. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, evening, night, whatever time it is for you. And we'll see you all next month. Thanks again, Christina. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.